Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to talk to you today, and I hope you find the information useful for your future work. When I was working for my previous organization, the International Plant Nutrition Institute, I was asked to be the potassium director. And in that new position, I was asked to focus specifically on potassium and improving potassium recommendations. I had been previously working in one area of the United States and now had to work globally. So to address that request, I found that I needed to identify other scientists who were actively publishing their work in potassium recommendations and on these potassium issues that were related to recommendations, not only publishing, but were still active in that kind of research. And potassium has not received the level of funding that, for instance, nitrogen and phosphorus have received. And so there were fairly few global scientists available to bring together. But we did locate about 12 scientists who were specializing in this kind of work and had a very diverse range of field expertise to laboratory expertise to mineralogy to plant physiology and so on. And we brought them together in two roundtable meetings to really assess the quantity of evidence and the quality of evidence. One of our first outputs was a new potassium cycle. We had been struck how the older potassium cycles that had been used throughout the literature and in textbooks were fairly incomplete. In particular, the losses of K from the system were not complete. So harvested plant K was the primary loss that most K cycles had described, but there were other losses as well. And one of those is open burning losses. So when fields are openly burned, that ash can carry with it potassium, and actually potassium chloride can form from the burning and be lost as particulates off field. Erosion and runoff losses of K, just like with phosphorus, and also leached K. So all of these losses were possible, but had not been well described in the previous K cycle. Another area where we greatly expanded was in the soil K. So in the earlier, more common K cycles, it was primarily 3 pools looking at soil solution K, exchangeable K, and non-exchangeable K. But there was a lot of mineralogical research that went unnoticed in that cycle. And so to include the research available, the soil K pools were expanded. And we brought all of this information together into a book that was published last year in 2021. And that book contains 15 chapters. And the central discussion point in that book is the K cycle, and trying to describe the various pools that are in that cycle and how they need to be considered when making potassium recommendations. So out of that work, one of the realizations or confirmations for many were that to really move the science forward, to make improvements, we first had to identify experts in the field and get them together. And several of the experts that we had brought together had not worked together. The other part was, I think with any scientific discussion, when you start talking about how can we make improvements, we go to, well, what data are you looking at for the kinds of recommendations or the kinds of conclusions that you're making? I'd like to look at your data. Uh, Please feel free to look at my data. Let's take a look and see, where are the discrepancies? What are the data telling us? And then finally, when we were sifting through literature and having discussions ourselves, became apparent that we weren't all talking the same language, that sometimes the terms that we were using were used differently among us. And so we found a real need to try to begin to clarify the terminology and standardize it in some way. And this is where I'd really like to focus, is I see this as the primary and first step to improving K recommendations, is going from working independently to working in communities of interest. And I think it's only in those communities that we can take our individual work, combine it, and create something with enough mass and enough momentum to move the science forward. So I'd like to talk about an example of working independently in nutrient recommendations. And this example comes from the United States. And to understand the context for independent work in the US, you really have to look at two acts that Congress passed in US history. The first was in 1862. It was called the Morrill Act. And this act created the land grant universities. It took public land and allocated it to states to build buildings and to create field experimental areas. And the emphasis was to be on agriculture and engineering. Several years later was the Smith-Lever Act that created the Cooperative Extension Service in the US. And the focus was state level. So all states received funding for extension, and each extension service in the state was tasked with meeting the needs of the people of that state. And so state borders were very real in funding and also in the scope of the work that was conducted. So there was a very early state focus in the extension work that was happening in the US. Now, one of the things that we can do with the US example is we can see what that independent, state-centric type of work results in after decades. So it's been over 100 years since that extension service was created. And what do we get in that kind of a system? Well, a recent paper looked at this exact issue. And they looked at it for states in the Southeast United States, which are shown in green, blue, and orange colors in the bottom right. And they were looking at how do potassium recommendations, the rates that are recommended for crops, how do they change from state to state? And an interesting way that they approached this comparison was to create some relationships like this, where they looked at one crop and one target yield for that crop. In this case, on the left axis, we're looking at potassium recommendations for maize with a 10.1 ton per hectare yield level. And the recommendations on the left are in kilograms of K per hectare. And we're looking, each line represents a different state's recommendation. And on the x-axis, you have Mehlich 3 soil test K. So you can see, maybe just looking at the largest difference, let's take a look at the recommendation for Florida. And you can see when the soil test level is 60 parts per million, that Florida recommends that no potassium be applied for a 10.1 ton per hectare maize crop. And on the opposite end of this, you have Arkansas, which would recommend approximately 100 kilograms of K per hectare for a maize crop at that same yield level. So when we're looking at these differences, why do they exist? To understand that, we need to take a look at the kinds of data that go into soil test-based potassium recommendations. And these are the kinds of things that are done. Typically, you'll go out into a field, and for a given replication, you'll measure the soil test level of that replication. And then treatments are randomly applied to that replication, and incremental rates are used, typically 6 rates, including a check, a 0. At the end of the season, grain yield is measured, and then there are regression analysis is the primary analytical technique used. And then there are 2 steps that are performed. There's a correlation step and a calibration step. So the correlation step looks like this. Correlation relates soil test level on the x-axis, in this case, Mehlich 3K for a dry, for soil samples that are dried before analysis. And it plots soil test level against relative yield. And relative yield is the observed yield divided by the maximum yield for that experiment or for that replication, depending on how the researchers did it. In the past, there's been some other ways of calculating relative yield. And in this case, for this particular experiment, the way that relative yield was calculated allowed some values greater than 100%. So that's been part of some more current efforts, is to standardize the way relative yield is calculated. But this is the kind of relationship that you get in a correlation. And one of the key findings in a correlation is this dotted line, this dotted vertical line that we call the critical level. It separates yield loss without fertilization from no yield loss without fertilization. So on the right side of that critical level, if a field is left unfertilized, for the most part, there's no significant yield losses. But as you start going farther and farther from that critical level on the toward the left, if that field remains unfertilized, that yield will continue to drop. And so the losses tend to be greater as you get to lower soil test levels if that soil is not fertilized. The calibration part takes those soil test levels and breaks them into ranges. And each range is given an interpretive category. So for instance, in this one, we have 5 categories. We're looking at going from very low to low, optimum, high, and very high. And here we have the ranges, and these ranges are in parts per million of either ammonium acetate or Mehlich 3 extractable K. And these are for samples that have been dried prior to laboratory analysis, and these ranges are for samples that have been left moist. And then here is the actual amount of potassium to apply, and it differs based on soil texture, with higher rates for the fine textured soils and lower rates for the sandy textured soils. So that's the calibration part. So when we see differences in recommendation, the question becomes, was it a difference in the calibration step, or was it a difference in the correlation step? And so without looking at the data, there's no way to know. And so one of the conclusions, an important one, from this paper that examined those differences in recommendations, was that we need a national database. We need to bring our data together. We need to look at what we have, and we need to discuss this, and we need to use our expertise to understand how to improve things. So in this US case, they went from working very independently, and they now have over 80 scientists that are actively involved in improving recommendations and sharing data. So now they're working in communities of interest. Now, this wasn't done in a vacuum. There had already been some work like this done in Australia. The Grain Research and Development Corporation had funded a lot of fertility research in the past, and it also funded bringing it together. And it brought it together into a central database that was applicable for the research that had been done in Australia. So that had been done many years ago. And the United States scientists used this as an example, and they developed their own soil test correlation and calibration database, which they just published the announcement of that with some supplemental information. So they now have a website, and they have created this fertilizer recommendation support tool. And it looks like currently the tool is providing information about the effort and links to papers and presentations. There were some important outputs beyond the database. And one of those in this US effort was the creation of a minimum data set and metadata guidelines. So in other words, if you want to share data with this community of interest, your data has to meet certain standards. There is a minimum set of descriptions and both data and metadata that need to be included for it to be acceptable to share with others. You have to be able to speak the same language, and the data have to be a certain quality. So here's just one example of one of the tables in that paper. There are several tables, but it gives you an idea that the kinds of information that they're wanting to standardize. And here's the status. This is the required set. There's also a recommended set, and that exists in each table. So if you just want the minimum requirements, you can look at the required measurements only. Something else that came out of this effort was greater transparency. In the literature, you can usually find the correlation work. That's relating soil test level with relative yield. What is very difficult to find is the calibration step. How was the correlation data and the data from the rate trials all combined and analyzed and interpreted to create categories and rate recommendations? And it exists in only a few places, and they typically are older publications. This is the first time that I've seen something in a recent publication be very descriptive about how those calibrations were done. And the authors provide two different methods for performing the calibration step. And I highly recommend that you read through that to see just how that calibration is done. But before, it was very nebulous how that was done. And that left it to a lot of interpretation that wasn't transparent. So in this particular example, and in others like it, when scientists begin to work together in communities of interest, they can create standards and build consensus. And this can provide a variety of outputs that serves not only their community, but many other communities that may rely on the kinds of data that they know best. So data descriptions, standardizing those, identifying the preferred experimental designs, defining field protocols and minimum data sets, What are the laboratory protocols? What kinds of analyses are recommended? How do we analyze the data once we have it? What kind of response models do we use? What kind of regression models? What does a community tend to use? And then how does it visualize the data? Correlation data always looks the same. It's always soil test level versus relative yield, and it's fit with some sort of a regression curve, and it's usually some linear plateau or quadratic plateau model. And in fact, Australia had that conversation and decided on one best model to use for their community. And you can also create quality assurance and quality control measures in that community. So this can be done at any scale. And if a community is working in the US, for instance, or in Australia, we've seen that the community in Australia influenced the community in the US. And in fact, if those two communities came together, they could probably create a new set or a revised set of standards that would serve both. And as these communities tend to or could merge, we could see some global types of standards created, kind of like the ISO standards. So there are other recommendation systems that can benefit from this movement to communities of interest and creating enough momentum to move the science forward. And work is going on in each one of these, but the soil tests example is the most recent. Just to give you a sense of completeness, there are other ways of making potassium recommendations. There are primarily plant tissue or plant uptake based methods, which can incorporate soil tests but do not have to. And this is the qualitative evaluation of the fertility of tropical soils model, the QEFS model. And one of the key relationships that it looks at is above ground K uptake. This is uptake by all above ground portions of the crop. And then regressing that against maize grain yield to come up with internal efficiency. And that internal efficiency can then be used to create a rate recommendation that is likely to result in the increase in uptake needed by a crop to reach a target yield level. In many vegetable crops and also tree crops, plant leaves are often sampled and their nutrient concentration examined. And tissue sufficiency ranges rely on the same types of correlation data that soil testing relies on. So on the x-axis here, we're seeing corn leaf K, this is ear leaf potassium at the R1 growth stage versus corn relative yield. Looks just like a soil test correlation relationship, except you've got leaf K on the x-axis. And here you can see a couple of models that were fit. The linear plateau provides a critical level that's lower than the quadratic plateau model, which has been well established in the literature. And so there's that discussion about what regression model do we use when we're interpreting these data. And so the community of interest can provide recommendations for those kinds of issues. Then there's DRIS, the Diagnostic and Recommendation Integrated System. This was developed back in the 1970s, and it's widely used today for many crops. There's ongoing research every year on DRIS, and there are many offshoots of DRIS that use this same kind of relationships of looking at ratios of concentrations of nutrients like leaf N divided by leaf K concentration, and then plotting that against yield to come up with norms or ratios associated with high yielding parts of the data set that create these DRIS norms that are then used to evaluate relative deficiency in nutrients within the tissue. And I will say that there's been a recent development doing these different kinds of regression models, like linear plateau, quadratic plateau, has often been used in SAS, but it's now become freely available to all of us who use open access software. And so this was a recent development, and I would just wanted to point you toward this as a resource. It's called Soil Test Core, and it's an R package. So I just want to end by saying that I think the best way to improve potassium recommendations is this process, forming these communities of interest, gaining the kind of momentum we need to move the science forward. And with that, thank you for your attention.